The late afternoon sun spilled across the quiet cul-de-sac, painting long golden stripes on the neatly trimmed lawns. A soft hum of sprinklers clicked on somewhere down the street. The neighborhood was the kind of place where people waved politely but didn't know each other's names, where the homeowners association sent passive-aggressive emails about trash cans left out too long. Nothing violent ever happened there. Or so Sarah thought. She was in the kitchen, humming to herself while unloading the dishwasher, when the sudden crunch of tires outside drew her attention. Not the slow roll of a neighbor coming home from work, but a heavy, deliberate stop, the kind of arrival that made the glass windows vibrate faintly in their frames. She glanced through the blinds. A matte black SUV sat at the curb, engine rumbling. The windows were tinted, concealing whoever was inside. Before she could think, the doors opened and two men climbed out. They were large, broad-shouldered, their movements purposeful. They wore tactical-style vests with Velcro patches, dark jeans, and heavy boots that clomped against the sidewalk. Both had shiny badge clips dangling from their belts, catching the sunlight like a lure. Her stomach tightened. Something felt wrong. The men didn't glance around as if looking for a house number. They walked straight up the path to her porch, quick and aggressive. The first one, a tall man with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses, carried a clipboard under one arm, the way a cop might carry a report. The second man had a square jaw and a scar that ran from his ear down into the collar of his shirt. He tapped on his vest pocket as if reassuring himself of something hidden there. The doorbell rang, once, hard. Then the pounding began. "Oh, enforcement," the buzz-cut man barked. His voice was too loud, too sharp, like he was used to scaring people into compliance. "Open the door. You're in violation of community rules." Sarah froze. Her mind raced. She'd never heard of the HOA sending enforcement officers, much less ones dressed like police. Normally, they sent letters or, at worst, a sternly worded email. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she forced herself to the door. She cracked it open just enough to see their faces. The smell of cheap cologne and cigarette smoke wafted in. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What violation?" "The HOA doesn't send police." The scarred man shoved the threshold, leaning in closer. "Don't play dumb. You think you're above the rules. We've had complaints. Now let us inside to inspect." "I don't think so," she replied, trying to push the door closed. The buzz-cut man moved faster than she expected. His hand shot out, slamming flat against the wood, forcing it wide open. She stumbled backward with a gasp, one hand instinctively rising to shield herself. He stepped over the threshold like your frightened place, his mirrored lenses reflecting her frightened face. "Listen, lady," he snapped, "you're not gonna give us attitude." Then it happened. The scarred man raised his hand and slapped her across the face. The sound cracked through the quiet house, sharp and humiliating. Her cheek burned instantly, her skin stinging under the blow. She staggered, nearly tripping over the rug. Tears welled in her eyes. Not just from pain, but from shock. It didn't make sense. This was her home, her safe space. These weren't cops, and they weren't acting like neighbors. "Don't talk back." The man sneered, stepping closer. His lips curled in a mocking grin. "We're in charge here. Got it." The two men pushed deeper into the living room, glancing around like predators sizing up their prey. One rifled through the mail on the entry table. The other let his hand rest just under his vest, where the bulge of a weapon pressed against the fabric. Sarah's knees shook. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but fear locked her throat. Her thoughts went to her husband upstairs. Jack. She prayed he hadn't heard the slap, prayed he wouldn't come down and make things worse. Then she heard it. The faint creak of a floorboard above. The slow, deliberate sound of footsteps. Both intruders froze for a moment, exchanging a glance. Buzzcut smirked. "Someone else home?" he asked, his tone mocking. Sarah didn't, was dry, her cheek still throbbing. She clutched the edge of the counter to steady herself. The footsteps grew louder. A shadow stretched down the staircase. Then he appeared. Jack descended slowly, his broad frame filling the narrow hallway, his eyes fixed on the scene below. His face was calm, unreadable, but Sarah recognized the fire building behind his eyes. He wasn't just her husband in that moment. He was the man he used to be. The man who had walked through fire in deserts and jungles, who had seen violence most people couldn't imagine, who carried the weight of years as a Navy SEAL etched into every scar, every muscle. His gaze lingered on Sarah first, on the red mark blooming across her cheek. His jaw tightened. Then his eyes shifted to the two strangers. He scission of a man trained to size up threats in a heartbeat. Their sloppy posture, their cheap gear, the way their hands shook just slightly, betraying nerves. "You just made the worst mistake of your lives," Jack said, his voice low and steady. The words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that silenced the room. The two intruders stiffened, their earlier bravado faltering as if they'd suddenly realized the ground had shifted beneath their feet. Sarah exhaled, a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Relief and dread tangled inside her. She knew what Jack was capable of when pushed. She knew those men had no idea what storm they just walked into. The silence stretched. The only sound was the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. Jack took another step down the stairs, his eyes never leaving theirs. His hands were relaxed at his sides, but Sarah saw that every movement was deliberate, controlled. A predator biding his time. The scarred man swallowed hard, his smirk gone. "Hey, we don't want any trouble," he muttered, but his words lacked conviction. Jack's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Trouble found you." The air thickened, charged with the promise of violence. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. She could see it building. The storm about to break. And in that suspended moment, she knew nothing in their quiet little neighborhood would ever feel the same again. The silence in the living room lasted only a breath, but it stretched long enough for Sarah to feel it press down on her chest. The two intruders stood frozen, shifting their weight uneasily, and her husband descended the last step like a shadow sliding into place. Jack's eyes never wavered from them. His expression was flat, almost bored, but Sarah could see the storm behind it, the kind of calm that comes before a strike. The scarred man straightened, trying to recover his bravado. "Back off, old man," he said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. His hand twitched toward the lump under his vest, but Jack was already moving. In an instant, he crossed the space between them. His elbow came up in a sharp arc, slamming into the scarred man's throat. The sound was a sickening, wet choke, followed by the man collapsing to the carpet, clutching his neck and gasping like a fish ripped from water. He writhed on the floor, unable to even scream properly. The second intruder, the one with the mirrored sunglasses, yanked at the pistol strapped to his hip, but Jack was already there. His hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist before the gun cleared its holster. With one brutal twist, Jack wrenched the arm until the joint popped audibly. The sunglasses clattered to the ground as the man howled, his face contorting in agony. Jack slammed his head forward into the drywall, leaving a dent in the plaster. Sarah stumbled backward against the kitchen counter, her hand still pressed against her stinging cheek, her breath quick and shallow. She had seen her husband train before, seen him move with precision at the gym, but never like this. This wasn't training. This was survival, instinct sharpened to a razor edge. The man with the broken wrist crumpled, but Jack didn't let him fall completely. He shoved him against the wall again, pinned him with one hand. The other man was still on the floor, gagging and clutching his throat, eyes bulging. "You think you can walk into my house and lay a hand on my wife?" Jack's voice was low, cold, and steady. "You think you're predators? You're prey." The pinned man whimpered, blood running from a cut above his brow where it had smacked the wall. His broken wrist dangled uselessly, swelling already. Jack shoved him harder, making the drywall crack beneath to tell him to stop, to pull him back before he went too far, but her voice failed her. Part of her was terrified, but another part, the deeper, truer part, felt a fierce surge of safety. She was shaken, but she wasn't alone. The man on the floor tried to crawl toward the door, dragging himself on his elbows, his throat wheezing with every breath. Jack noticed, stepped over, and planted his boot firmly between the man's shoulders, pinning him like an insect. The intruder cried out, his voice mangled by the damage to his windpipe. "You come here dressed like cops," Jack continued, his eyes drilling into the man against the wall. "You think a badge clip and some attitude make you men. You have no idea what it takes to be one." The scarred man gurgled beneath Jack's boot, his fingers clawing at the carpet. The other man squirmed helplessly, his eyes darting to Sarah as though pleading for her to intervene. Sarah finally managed, her voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't say stop. She didn't say keep going. She just said his name, anchoring him. Jack drew in a slow breath, then stepped back, letting the man on the floor collapse in a heap. He grabbed the other by his vest and dragged him toward the door. The man stumbled, barely able to stay upright as Jack shoved him forward. Sarah flinched at the sound of the front door crashing open as both intruders were tossed out onto the lawn like trash. They landed hard on the grass, groaning, broken, faces swollen and bloodied. One clutched his shattered wrist to his chest, rocking back and forth. The other lay on his side, cuffing violently, each sound wet and painful. Their SUV sat waiting at the curb, but neither of them seemed capable of reaching it. Jack stepped outside, towering over them. The late sun threw his shadow long across the lawn, swallowing the men who had dared to invade his home. "If you ever come near this house again," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet street, "I won't be so merciful." The word merciful hung in the air like a threat sharper than any weapon. Somewhere down the block, a neighbor's curtain twitched. A dog barked nervously. And then, faint but growing louder, came the wail of approaching sirens. The sound seemed to drain the last of the fight out of the two impostors. They curled in on themselves, reduced to pathetic heaps under the flashing blue and red glow cresting the corner. Real police cars screeched to a halt, doors flying open as officers rushed out, weapons drawn. "Hands where we can see them," one shouted, aiming at the men sprawled on the grass. Jack raised his hands calmly, stepping back onto the porch, his chest rising and falling with steady control. "They're not cops," he said firmly, pointing at the broken men. "They're impostors. They assaulted my wife. I stopped them." The officers moved quickly, cuffing the two intruders despite their groans of protest and cries of pain. Up close, the cheap plastic badges clipped to their belts told the whole story. Fakes, badly made, nothing like the real thing. Sarah stepped outside at last, clutching her arms around herself. One of the officers glanced at her cheek, already swelling where the slap had landed. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She nodded shackily. "I am now." Her eyes flicked to Jack, who hadn't moved from the porch. The officers hauled the impostors upright and shoved them into the back of separate patrol cars. One tried to stammer excuses, blaming the other, but his words were lost in the slam of the car door. The scarred man coughed miserably, his voice a rasping whisper. Neither dared look at Jack again. The sirens faded as the cars pulled away, leaving only the faint smell of burned rubber and the broken silence of the street. Jack turned back to Sarah. His expression softened the moment his eyes met hers. He closed the distance between them and gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing the angry red mark on her cheek. "No one touches you," he said quietly. "Not while I'm here." Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they weren't from fear. She buried her face in his chest, inhaling the familiar scent of him, grounding herself in the solidity of his arms. Behind them, the porch light flicked on automatically as dusk settled over the neighborhood. To any passerby, it would look like a normal house at the end of a normal street. But Sarah knew better. This home was different. It had been tested, and it had been defended. And those men, the ones who thought they could intimidate, impersonate, and harm, would carry the memory of Jack's wrath for the rest of their lives. They had walked into the wrong house, and it had cost them their pride, their bones, and maybe more. Inside, the clock ticked steadily, marking the return of calm. But Sarah knew that in her husband's eyes, there had never been any question. He had always been ready. He always would be.